Thanks for joining us here at I-24 News. Let's take a look at this hour's headlines. I'm Michelle Divon. We're beginning in Israel, where a vote on the controversial regulation bill is expected to be held this evening after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Jewish Home Party leader Naftali Bennett reach an agreement after weeks of clashing, one that could see thousands of Jewish homes in the West Bank legalized. The new deal requires finding proper relocation for all of the 42 families of Amona. Now, to do that, the government intends once again to petition the Supreme Court for a postponement of 30 days. This after the court already denied its appeal for a 7-month postponement.
We all understand the plight of the residents and appreciate the dedication. The solution we offer would allow residents to stay on the mountain as a community. Yes, they will have to move a few hundred feet or a few hundred meters. But it is very big and important news.
And to discuss this, we're joined by Eli Hochenberg, our diplomatic correspondent. So, Eli, after weeks of clashes or disagreements between Bennett and Netanyahu, they reach an agreement and they decide that the Amona outpost will move 100 meters. What do you make of this?
Well, first, it's important to stress that the residents are unimpressed by this solution, but we will get to that shortly. Let's try and put some order into things. We have the regulation bill that, as you said, is expected to be voted on tonight in a preliminary reading. The problem with this regulation bill and the reason that Netanyahu failed to garner the needed support within his own coalition until now was the infamous Clause 7, which talked about the Amona outpost. The problem there was that we had a previous ruling by the Supreme Court ordering the eviction of the settlement. And this is why a main faction within the coalition, the Kulanu party, led by Finance Minister Moshe Kahlon, refused to vote in favor of this bill, fearing that it will only further undermine the Supreme Court.
So the vote will be held without Amona being a part of it tonight?
Exactly. Okay. And now you solve the problem of garnering the support of the Kulanu party. More than that, the state is likely to request once again to postpone the eviction date. Back in the previous time, the Supreme Court rejected this appeal.
They asked for a 7-month appeal at that time. Today, they're asking for 30 days.
Correct. And once again, the Supreme Court rejected this appeal because of the infamous Clause 7. And now, when it's off the table, the Supreme Court might give the state another postponement. So now we are left with two main parties, the settlers, which, as said, are unimpressed by this motion. They still they're looking for someone to blame, and this is what might trigger another fierce battle between Netanyahu and his right-wing rival Naftali Bennett. Each one of them will try to blame the other for this unsatisfying solution, so he will not compromise the right-wing electorate. And we are also left with the problem of the international community.
Of course, and a very sensitive time when we have Kerry talking about settlements as the main impediment for peace, and at the same time Netanyahu saying that Amona and the residents will remain in the West Bank. He specifically said in his words that we just heard.
Absolutely. And more than that, again, the Amona dilemma might be solved in this way or another, but the regulation bill at the end of the day is aimed at normalizing the status of many other outposts throughout the West Bank, and the reaction of the international community on this factor is likely to be quite harsh.
And Eli, why do you think they're trying to buy time? I mean, the evacuation is supposed to be on the 25th, so even if they have to move, this outpost will have to be evacuated. Why is it so important for them to delay it? Do you think they will try to maybe change the fate still of Amona and try to reverse this ruling altogether?
Well, so far they stalled time in order to reach an understanding within the frameworks of the ruling coalition. Now there is a good reason to ask to postpone the eviction date, because we are talking about a concrete solution to relocate those families. It is true that it is to a nearby land, but still a very complex operation, and the state will request to have some more time to prepare. And again, the Supreme Court now has a good reason to approve this appeal. It remains to be seen, but the first hurdle will be later on tonight, the preliminary vote on this bill.
Indeed, and still internationally very controversial. Eli Hochenberg, thanks very much for this. As we moved to Turkey-Israel relations, Israel's new ambassador to Turkey, Eitan, presented today his credentials to President Erdogan, hailing a new phase in bilateral ties. Ney is Israel's first ambassador in Ankara in half a decade. He was greeted by Erdogan in the presidential palace for a short ceremony, and a military band played Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, right before. Staying in Israel, from fame and fortune to a 2-year jail sentence. Dankner, one of Israel's most prominent and once influential business tycoons, was sentenced today after being found guilty of stock manipulation to 2 years in jail. The former controlling shareholder of IDB was given 24 months in prison and a fine of 800,000 shekels, which amounts to $209,000. Dankner, whose family made his fortune in table salt and real estate, lost control of IDB in 2014 after struggling with billions of shekels in debt in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And to discuss this, we're joined by Dr. Alex Coman, a high-tech and financial expert. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good evening.
So, Dr. Coman, how much of a shakeup would you say is this for the Israeli market? And specifically, how much of a shock or maybe scare is this for tycoons in Israel?
Well, I think it's an excellent shock. I think there's nothing as effective as seeing somebody go to jail, especially there's so much coverage and there was so much discussion of the trial. So I think it would have excellent impact on the Israeli tycoon scene. Because if you think about Dankner, he basically inherited huge amounts of money, but he used this money to manipulate the stocks, to build a huge pyramid rather than specialize in a certain area. So the combination of being spread on many, many areas, as well as being leveraged, this is a very bad idea, and I hope that many tycoons would learn to observe, not to go in this direction.
Now, initially, Dankner was only fined, and only today was given this ruling. I mean, do you think this is really a public statement and something that's really trying to deliver a message as you're hoping it will?
Well, stock manipulation is very difficult to demonstrate. It's very difficult to demonstrate that somebody convinced his friends to buy the stock. I think that Dankner's problem was that he was quite overconfident, and as a result, they could actually prove it. So I think that this would send a straight message to the financial community that if you actually manipulate stock in an unfair way, and as a result, simple people pay the fine for that, you are going to go to jail. I think this is a very good, very positive message.
Dr. Alex Coman, indeed a very historic day, I think, for the financial echelon in Israel. Thanks so much for your insight. Further turbulence in Europe as Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi announced his stepping down following a referendum defeat. In a late-night news conference, a tearful Renzi saying he takes full responsibility for the outcome. Gabby Weiniger reports.
It's a significant defeat for Matteo Renzi. He's set to step down after a resounding no to a referendum on reforming the constitution.
The experience of my government ends here. I believe that I could change this political system in which the leaders are always the same and they exchange among them the position of political responsibility and who do nothing to change Italy. They always remain faithful to their habits and stick to their chairs. I wanted to erase the many armchairs of the Italian politics in the senates, in the provinces, etc. I did not succeed in this attempt, and therefore the only armchair that jumps is mine.
Yet it's also a defeat for a contented Europe. The vote was seen as a chance to register discontent with the establishment, and exit polls suggest a no was backed by 59.5% of those who voted.
I think with this vote, the Italian people wanted to express not only a no to the constitutional reform, but also a firm no to the policies of the government and of the European Union.
It may mean early elections for Italy and the possibility of a Eurosceptic party, the opposition Five-Star movement behind the No campaign, gaining power. There's also another anti-party to consider, the Northern League, anti-immigration, and allied to leader of the French far right, Marine Le Pen.
Anti-establishment, Eurosceptical or anti-European forces will certainly be the major beneficiaries of a no victory.
Either option would be a challenge to the European Union, losing an ally in Renzi and facing an uncertain future. But it's Italy that wakes up to the immediate aftermath of his resignation.
There is a lot of uncertainty in international markets like the referendum in Italy, and we don't know whether the EU is going to break up or not. And then in the US, very clearly, interest rates will be hiked next week. So there's just too much uncertainty, and everybody is holding back, and just right now cash is king.
Along with a potential banking crisis for the euro's third largest economy, political turmoil and the possibility of a populist anti-establishment government in Europe for the first time since World War II. There are more precarious votes to come from the bloc next year. France, the Netherlands, Germany, and now Italy too.
The no vote won. Roma won. It couldn't have gone better than that tonight. Go Roma, go, no!
And German Chancellor Angela Merkel, reacting to the result of Italy's referendum, said she was saddened by Prime Minister Matteo Renzi's defeat over constitutional reform. Merkel spoke to reporters in Essen ahead of a conference of her own conservative CDU party. Take a listen.
I am sad that the referendum in Italy did not turn out as the Prime Minister wished, because I always supported his reform policies, but it is, of course, a domestic Italian decision that we must respect. This was about a wide range of issues within Italy. From my point of view, we will continue our work in Europe, and we have set the right focus. But I have always worked very well with Matteo Renzi.
Now, the Italian referendum is already having major repercussions on markets, and not just in Italy. Markets fell across Europe, and the euro plunged against the dollar. Here's more.
European markets fell and the euro sank against the dollar as Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi announced he would resign after losing an important referendum. The euro dropped to a 20-month low amid the growing political uncertainty.
There is a lot of uncertainty in international markets like the referendum in Italy, and we don't know whether the EU is going to break up or not. There's just too much uncertainty, and everybody is holding back, and just right now cash is king.
The instability comes at a delicate time for Italy's economy, particularly its fragile banking sector. Many of the country's banks are saddled with high debt levels, and the prospect of changing political leadership will not help attract new investment. Indeed, Italy's third-largest bank, Monte dei Paschi di Siena, is due to conduct a massive €5 billion recapitalization, a venture now threatened by the referendum results. The country's public debt, already at 133% of GDP, would hinder the prospect of a national bailout of banks, should it come to that. With only 1 year until elections, a caretaker government will need to focus on banking reform if it is to keep the economy afloat.
I think the implications going forward is going to mean an overhaul of banking regulations, not only in Italy, but in Europe generally. The banks have been much too constrained, and they have been mis-selling a lot of their products.
The third largest Eurozone economy, Italy has suffered from a prolonged period of stagnation since joining the EU. The country is grappling with 11% unemployment and has yet to fully recover from the 2008 recession. A new premier would need to fix these problems quickly and rescue the flailing banking sector, or risk seeing the anti-EU five-star movement rise to power next election cycle.
And we're shifting now to the French political landscape following President François Hollande's announcement he will not seek a second term. Socialist Prime Minister Manuel Valls is set to announce later this evening about his own presidential bid. His announcement comes after François Fillon's victory on the center-right ballot. Currently behind the center-right, Republicans and far-right National Front, the ruling socialists will hold a primary of their own in January to elect their candidate. And senior political analyst Christian Malard joins us now to discuss the political uncertainty throughout Europe and specifically France. Good evening to you.
Hello from the Paris Bureau. Yeah.
Hello. So, Christian, the Austrian far right was defeated. Matteo Renzi lost a referendum and is stepping down. What's expected for France? And are we even in a position to predict?
Well, I'm not going to predict, because look at the polls, look at the press being very wrong many times. In the United States, for the Brexit, with Italy. Anyway, let's put it this way. France is like many countries. You have a French public opinion which is definitely fed up with the traditional parties of the establishment, which means the right-wing party. We have seen it with former President Nicolas Sarkozy, and with the Socialist Party, who is very weak and divided. So tonight you have, in 90 minutes from now, you will have French Prime Minister Valls resigning officially from his position of Prime Minister and announcing that he's bid for the candidacy to the presidency, which will take place 5 months from now. But believe me, all the French political landscape is in a big shambles. It's a real mess, as I have never seen for years and years in this country. Mr. Valls will have the primaries, as you said very well, in the end of January, 22nd and 29th. And he will have in front of him 7 to 8 contenders. And one of them, which is not in the primary, and you have talked about him many times in the past, Monsieur Emmanuel Macron. Macron is the former Secretary of Finance, and he goes on his own. But definitely, there are 2 big problems ahead for Valls. First, to reconcile the party, the Socialist Party, because he is the impersonation of the right wing inside the left wing. And he has to get to face all these people who are very definitely socialist and left-wing. First challenge to face, difficult. Second one, Macron. Macron plays in the same courtyard. They have the same ideas. They are quite center-right, whatever. So it will be very difficult, even if he is given as the favorite for the primary of next January. And then we will see what happens with the right wing, Monsieur Fillon, who is the head of the right wing now, and Madame Le Pen. We must not forget her. Madame Le Pen, who is hoping to play the same kind of role, a positive role, and let's say to play like the card of the winner, as did the people with the Brexit, Mr. Trump in the United States. And Madame Le Pen is very happy with what's just happened in Italy with the exit of Matteo Renzi and the coming to power slowly but surely of the Five Stars movement of Pepe Grillo. So it's all these things which are developing and which is at stake for the coming future. To be a prophet, to be a predictor is going to be very difficult.
I see you're being very cautious this evening with your predictions, but thank you very much, Christian Malard, for weighing in. Now, highly charged, sensitive, and regarded worldwide as a reference point for the populist movement, Brexit is now being presented before Britain's Supreme Court. A historic hearing that will decide whether Parliament has to approve the government's Brexit negotiations, a move that could delay the country's exit from the EU. The head of Britain's Supreme Court says the Brexit case is about law, not wider politics.
The justices of the court are, of course, aware of the public interest in this case, and we are aware of the strong feelings associated with the many other wider political questions surrounding the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union. However, as will be apparent from the arguments before us, those wider political questions are not the subject of this appeal. This appeal is concerned with legal issues, and as judges, our duty is to consider those issues impartially and to decide the case according to the law. That is what we will do.
And we're now joined live via Skype by Jonathan Sachadati, our correspondent based in London. Jonathan, the High Court ruled last month that the government did not have the executive power alone to invoke Article 50. The government today is appealing this ruling.
Indeed, and you heard Lord Neuberger there, who's the president of the Supreme Court, explaining that this is not a political court case, that the matters that these 11 judges are going to be deciding on are purely to do with legal issues, to do with the UK Constitution. That is to say that where some people have accused them of intervening too closely in a choice that was offered to the British population, which they then made to leave the EU, they are saying that they're doing no such thing and that this is purely an issue of legality, that they need to decide whether Gina Miller and those others who brought the case saying that they needed there to be a vote in Parliament, whether those people are correct in saying that they are having rights of theirs removed by Britain invoking Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty to start that process of leaving the EU, or whether the government can use this old-fashioned prerogative, which means that they can make these decisions without consulting the rest of the MPs in Parliament. And that's what this is being discussed right now in the Supreme Court. We'll see over the coming days, and then with a verdict in January, which side these Supreme Court judges will come down on.
So what happens next if the government does indeed lose the Brexit appeal?
So if they lose, as I said, we probably won't hear the judgment in full until January, at which point there's a bit of a ticking clock for Theresa May, because she said that she wished to trigger Article 50, which starts the process of negotiation for Britain to leave the EU, by the end of March in 2017. That gives her very little time to have that debate in the Commons and then have the vote, hoping that the majority of members of Parliament, whether they were pro-leave or not before the referendum, will back her decision to trigger Article 50 in that time frame, and will get the ball rolling on the negotiations. The fear, of course, that they have in the government and that Theresa May has been expressing is that the other parties, other than the Conservative Party and even some Conservative rebels, may wish to impose conditions on their vote to support the triggering of Article 50, and that might make her compromise her hand in negotiations so that she feels she'll be in a weaker position when she comes to negotiate with the rest of the European nations. So all of these things still to play, but what will be happening most likely if the government loses this appeal is that she will be bringing to Parliament a bill that will have them discuss this and vote on it, hoping that, in fact, the majority of MPs will follow in line with the population's choice and decide to trigger Article 50 as she had planned.
Jonathan Sacerdoti, thanks so much for this. And we're moving now to the U.S., where President-elect Donald Trump has chosen former rival Ben Carson as his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The retired neurosurgeon is now charged with turning around troubled U.S. inner cities. Carson is the first African-American selected by Trump for his team. He has no background in housing policy, but has cited his poor childhood in Detroit as a qualification for the job. ABC News has more.
Big cabinet announcements are expected this week from President-elect Donald Trump. This morning, Dr. Ben Carson, a neurosurgeon, nominated to be the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development.
It'll be a team that'll make America strong and prosperous again.
That dinner last week didn't seem to seal the deal for Mitt Romney. ABC News has learned that Trump is broadening his search for a Secretary of State and is now considering as many as 9 candidates. In addition to Romney, Rudy Giuliani, Senator Bob Corker, and David Petraeus, former ambassador to China John Huntsman, an Obama appointee, is now in the mix.
We've got a president here in Donald Trump that wants to look at the best and brightest of America, regardless of background, regardless of past disputes that we may have had with each other.
One of the biggest issues the next Secretary of State could be facing, relations with China. Trump's decision to ignore 4 decades of American diplomatic protocol and take a phone call from the president of Taiwan, angering Chinese officials. Taiwan is officially part of China, not an independent nation.
It's a little mystifying to me that President Obama can reach out to a murdering dictator in Cuba in the last year and be hailed as a hero for doing it. And President-elect Donald Trump takes a courtesy call from a democratically elected leader in Taiwan, and it's become something of a controversy.
And looking at U.S.-Japan relations, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is slated to become the first of the country's leaders to visit Pearl Harbor. Abe will be in Hawaii late December for meetings with U.S. President Barack Obama and will visit the site of the surprise Japanese attack that began World War II in the Pacific. The Hawaii visit follows Obama's visit in May to Hiroshima, the Japanese city where a U.S. plane dropped the world's first atomic bomb near the end of the war. And we're shifting now and taking a look at Japanese-Russian relations. Shinzo Abe says he hopes for progress in peace treaty talks with the Kremlin. However, their decades-old issue cannot be settled in one meeting. The two countries are caught up in a feud dating back to the end of World War II, after Russia seized 4 islands known as the Northern Territories.
I want us two leaders to discuss this frankly and with open minds in a calm atmosphere and make progress in negotiations on a peace treaty. This is not an issue that could be resolved in just one meeting, but keeping the desires of the elderly former residents of the islands in my mind, I would like to make relentless steps forward based on a trusted relationship I've established with President Putin.
And that wraps up our news bulletin. More headlines at the top of the hour. A very sensitive time when we have Kerry talking about settlements as the main impediment for peace, and at the same time Netanyahu saying that Amona and the residents will remain in the West Bank. He specifically said in his words that we just heard.
Absolutely, and more than that, again, the Amona dilemma might be solved in this way or another, but the regulation bill at the end of the day is aimed at normalizing the status of many other outposts throughout the West Bank, and the reaction of the international community on this factor is likely to be quite harsh.
And Ellie, why do you think they're trying to buy time? I mean, the evacuation is supposed to be on the 25th. So even if they have to move, this outpost will have to be evacuated. Why is it so important for them to delay it? Do you think they will try to maybe change?
Rejected this
appeal? They asked for a 7-month appeal at that time. Today they're asking for 30 days.
Correct. And once again, the Supreme Court rejected this appeal because of the infamous Clause 7. And now, when it's off the table, the Supreme Court might give the state another postponement. So now we are left with two main parties, the settlers, which, as said, are unimpressed by this motion. They still they're looking for someone to blame, and this is what might trigger another fierce battle between Netanyahu and his right-wing rival Naftali Bennett. Each one of them will try to blame the other for this unsatisfying solution, so he will not compromise the right-wing electorate. And we are also left with the problem of the international community, which had in a preliminary reading. The problem with this regulation bill and the reason that Netanyahu failed to garner the needed support within his own coalition until now was the infamous Clause 7, which talked about the Amona outpost. The problem there was that we had a previous ruling by the Supreme Court ordering the eviction of the settlement. And this is why a main faction within the coalition, the Kulanu party, led by Finance Minister Moshe Kahlon, refused to vote in favor of this bill, fearing that it will only further undermine the Supreme Court.
So the vote will be held without Amona being a part of it tonight.
Exactly. Okay. And now you solve the problem of garnering the support of the Kulanu party. More than that, the state is likely to request once again to postpone the eviction date. Back in the previous time, the Supreme Court
Thanks for joining us here at I-24 News. Let's take a look at this hour's headlines. I'm Divon. We're beginning in Israel, where a vote on the controversial regulation bill is expected to be held this evening after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Jewish Home Party leader Naftali Bennett reach an agreement after weeks of clashing, one that could see thousands of Jewish homes in the West Bank legalized. The new deal requires finding proper relocation for all of the 42 families of Amona. Now, to do that, the government intends once again to petition the Supreme Court for a postponement of 30 days. This after the court already denied its appeal for a 7-month postponement.
We all understand the plight of the residents and appreciate the dedication. The solution we offer would allow residents to stay on the mountain as a community. Yes, they will have to move a few hundred feet or a few hundred meters. But it is very big and important news.
And to discuss this, we're joined by Eli Hochenberg, our diplomatic correspondent. So, Eli, after weeks of clashes or disagreements between Bennett and Netanyahu, they reach an agreement and they decide that the Amona outpost will move 100 meters. What do you make of this?
Well, first, it's important to stress that the residents are unimpressed by this solution, but we will get to that shortly. Let's try and put some order into things. We have the regulation bill that, as you said, is expected to be voted on tonight.